about our history, mainly in Egypt, in Egyptology. So I just wanted your opinion, because I hate the narrative that people believe that the ancient Egyptians were not African people, were not black people. That like a lot of people, the Cleopatra thing, how they pretty much depict her as a European woman. So I just wanted your quick, response on that, because I just feel as though with they're kind of covering up our history, and I never really knew much about that, but I know you always have an explanation for everything. So why is it that most of the ancient Egyptians are depicted as whites? When we Great question.
I would say this: you have two groups that have an issue with ancient Nile Valley culture being an African culture, a black African culture. You have the Arabs who invaded North Africa, who now control Nile Valley culture in terms of the artifacts that is in Arab hands. They hate it because, number one, they didn't do it. And also because they are Islamic, they hate it from a religious perspective because Islam says there is to be no graven images of the deity. So they are against the images of it. And there was even talk years ago where the Egyptian government wanted to destroy all the statues of our ancestors. And it took the international community to pressure them to not do it. And of course, they would have lost a lot of tourism money too, but they was going to get rid of all the statues, the pyramids. They said this is anti-Islamic. We're going to destroy it. And then the internet. So they're jealous because they didn't do it. The Europeans are also jealous because they are not the fathers of Nile Valley culture. And the Europeans have always been obsessed with Nile Valley culture. The Washington, D.C. is a counterfeit copy of Nile Valley culture. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, a counterfeit copy of the geographic layout of Nile Valley culture. And you go across America. I spoke at, was it Cal State or the University of California? And they have a pyramid on their campus. The Japanese tried to build a pyramid the way our ancestors did, and they could not do it. There's pyramids all over the place. There's sphinxes all over the place. There's statues of ancestors of other races that were created where they are sitting or kneeling in the exact same way that our ancestors were in the great architecture of ancient Kemet. Abraham Lincoln's statue, the Lincoln Monument in D.C., that is a replica of the Ramesses monument back home in Kemet. So the Europeans hate admitting Kemet was black because it is the greatest, by far, unequaled, unparalleled. Kemet, or the entire Nile Valley culture, because we don't like to separate it out. Whether you go with Nubia, Ethiopia, Kemet, all of that, from the mouth of the Nile all the way up to the top of Egypt, that had never been seen before, and it had never been seen since. And for white people with their superiority complex, to admit that a civilization we are obsessed with, no, my sister, Mexico does not compare to Kemet, okay? And we're not going to compare the two because Mexico was civilized by Kemet, and those pyramids in Mexico was built by Africans themselves. But nonetheless, Europeans cannot admit that Africans built that civilization because it automatically invalidates. It automatically invalidates their false claim to intellectual, cultural, and historical superiority. In addition to that, we know that Herodotus Epictetus, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, all of the fathers of European intellectual culture, the Greco-Roman philosophers, they all came and studied at the feet of our grand master teacher ancestors in Kemet. The reason the white man can never admit that Kemet was a black African civilization is because it undoes and renders false most of the intellectual and cultural assumptions that he has taught and put into his textbooks. He cannot do it. This is why they don't support critical race theory. This is why they don't teach African history. This is why they don't want to teach the truth of racism or slavery, because the European intellectual heritage is very, very weak. European intellectual heritage, and I'm going to shut up because we only got 30 minutes left, but European intellectual heritage is very, very weak because its assumptions are false, have almost no documented support. And whenever you go looking for the origin of European intellectual culture, you find African culture right beneath it. So wherever you find a European numerator, there's an African denominator right there. The last piece I'm going to say to this: Europeans are not an ancient people. Let me say this again. Europeans are not an ancient people. They don't go back as far as you go back. Okay? The Iliad and the Odyssey written by Homer are some of the earliest evidence of European intellectual history. Okay? 1000 BC is when we really start to see European intellectual culture. 1000 years before Christ. That is not a long time. That is not a long time. And although there is evidence of European intellectual culture before then, it's not much compared to the plethora of African intellectual culture, which is why Europeans use the word classical. When you are in history class, they talk about classical European civilization, classical European intellectual heritage, classical European art. You don't hear them talk about ancient Europe. There's no ancient Europe. There's no ancient Greece, no ancient Rome. No, they're not an ancient people. They don't go back that far. They are the babies. They are the babies of the human race. And this is why white supremacy is so ruthless. This is why they burn the books. This is why they don't let certain texts in colleges and in public schools, because they understand that their claim to intellectual superiority is held together by the thinnest of evidence. As the most honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey said, the white man's propaganda is his greatest weapon, and everybody who has come in contact with it has become his slave. Let me say it again. The white man's propaganda is his greatest weapon, and everyone who has come in contact with it has become his slave.